Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. Thanks for coming today. I think you all know me, but I'm Ranjana Khanna. I'm the director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, which is where you are. And starting last semester and over this semester, we're hosting a series of discussions about the humanities at Duke as a way of highlighting the distinctiveness of the effort here, the ongoing high quality of the research and scholarship in the area, and a commitment, perhaps we should say at this point, as I said last time, the right to a humanities education. As you know, the story goes that in the 1980s, when a decision was made to make Duke into a top-notch university, there was substantial investment into the humanities, and much effort was made to hire scholars who were already established and who had a vision for what our fields should or could look like. In turn, they hired people, senior and junior, to fulfill those roles with innovative ideas, a sense of potentiality, or of what it meant at the time to build an institution with a leading and robust humanities to train the future of generation of teachers and scholars for the late 20th century. And many of those people were and remain some of the most significant scholars of our time. In this series so far, we've heard from Kathy Davidson and Carla Holloway on the idea of creating a humanities institute at Duke, specifically one that bore the name of John Hope Franklin. We also heard from Gregson Davis, who reflected on his career in the classics and comparative literature and what he brought to Duke through a consideration of the structures of colonial education that cemented both a love and care for works that were shaping traditions and radically questioning them, and the particular moments of change he participated in at Berkeley in the 1960s, Stanford at the height of the culture wars, Cornell during and in the aftermath of the theory wars, and the beginnings of the ethical term. Stanley Fish and Jane Tompkins talked about the invitation to Duke that they had received to build something rather extraordinary in the humanities, the challenges of doing that, and in their very, very different ways, the boldness and the loneliness of that project, to make something of Duke on the one hand, and to shift modes of thinking pedagogically at the institution, and to negotiate what was becoming of the idea of the humanities. And the idea of a humanities vocation, one might say. On the one hand, super professionalized in the preparation for a market, building something that was shiny and new, and on the other hand, nurturing, affirmative, understanding the life in the academy as a kind of calling. The format today, I mean, let me also add that Duke has benefited, I think, from probably both those visions. It might seem in my introduction that I have a preference for one rather than the other. But anyway, moving on. The format today is that we will be in conversation. And I'm really delighted to have Mandy Berry, who teaches at the American University in D.C., Jonathan Flatley, who has very recently moved to the University of Chicago, and Katie King at Williams College. I'm not going to give formal introductions to the really amazing work that each of them has done. You know, there will be another time for that when we will invite each of them back individually and celebrate the particular kind of work that they've done in that way. But what I want to do is maybe just sort of think with them and with you all about the project of queer theory as it was being developed in the 90s at Duke. How we date the origin of the project of queer theory, of course, has been up for debate for a long time. Is it 1905 Vienna? Is it 1974 or 1976 in Paris? Is it the advent of HIV, AIDS, ACT UP, Queer Nation, etc.? All this is up for debate. Whether we find its shaping in continuity or discontinuity with feminism, deconstruction, psychoanalysis, gay and lesbian studies, it's all contentious. But it is certainly the case that Duke in the 1990s was a place when it was being formulated and debated. Some would argue actually created. Sedgwick, Moon, to be sure, but also the students who were here at the time, who were formed with them, who were participating in the practice of the development of something we now know as queer theory. When I look at the work of Jonathan and Katie and Mandy, from that time, or reflecting on that time, what I see also is a consideration of the way in which queer theory was certainly sort of positioned as an anti-identity politics, but also a consideration of what that actually meant in the first place. And to be sure also, there is something of an idea of the collective that is at work for all of them. With that said, I'd love to just start off with asking you how it is that you decided to come here in the first place. What was it that you were looking for? Why Duke?
And I guess I'll start. I'm Katie Kent, and first, thank you, Ranji, and thank you, Michael, for your work in getting us here, and thanks to Duke. Really appreciate that. I met Eve Sedgwick when she came to my undergraduate institution to give a talk, and I was immediately very interested because she was doing something that seemed different than what I had been doing, which was mainly sort of lesbian, feminist, identity-based, French feminist influenced work. But then I applied to graduate school and visited Duke and had quite a strange experience, and Eve wasn't here. So it felt very much like a regional university from a different era. And the person who showed me around was a white older gentleman, and I was a little confused. And then I went to look at some other schools, and someone at another school took me aside and said, if you want to do what now is called queer theory, queer studies, you should go to Duke and work with Eve Sedgwick.
Well, that person was Jonathan Goldberg, right?
Yeah, that was Jonathan Goldberg. You're not supposed to out him here. And then I called Eve, and I'll never forget, because the chug of the dot matrix printer was going on in the background, and she's like, well, of course you're coming here. Where else would you go? And so that was sort of Eve in a nutshell. And so I came, and I want to acknowledge, and you mentioned a few people, Jose Munoz, who was in my cohort, and Brian Selsky, also who was in my cohort, who are no longer with us, but also many other students who aren't here, some of whom were in the kind of collective that we were in, but also others that were in other collectives and got lots out of the same experience. So I'm honored to be here, but I wouldn't say I represent everybody who was in this experience together. I took my first class with Eve, my first semester at Duke, and I think it was her first class that she taught at Duke. And we read, amongst other things from Between Men. We read, I believe, The Galleys of Epistemology of the Closet. Of course, we read Foucault, we read Freud. And again, sort of to echo some of what you said, the introduction to epistemology was really important for me. And Eve says, people are different. And she had a gift for the taxonymic, but in my sort of gay, lesbian, identity politic world, to have to think about that was really, really interesting and exciting. She also talked about, as opposed to essential versus constructed as a way of thinking about identity, the notion of minoritizing, and when that was a useful strategy for talking about gay identity versus universalizing. When we think about how an issue of sexuality is important to everyone. And that work really intersected immediately with HIV/AIDS issues Eve had friends who were dying at the time and ill with AIDS, and we were all sort of coming into that consciousness if we hadn't already. But just in the terms of educating people by identity categories versus by the practices, the sexual practices that they engaged in. And so a universalizing model of everybody might engage in these kinds of sexual and other kinds of practices of transmission versus only these particular identity groups. So those kinds of things were really important to me in opening up for me what was possible as a scholar. And then, you know, I think they were also the precursor of what by 1990-ish she was calling queer. And of course, when we debate the origins of that, certainly we want to include the HIV/AIDS activism. I wouldn't credit Eve alone with coining that term or articulating it, but Queer and Now, which is her first essay, and Tendencies, was really central to, I think, when we think about a collective, opening up possibilities for people whose identities and identifications were really multiple. And so sort of moving beyond that identity politics model. Now I'll let these guys have a chance.
I'll just be, yeah, Katie, that's great. I mean, I came a year after Katie, and I didn't come to study with Eve. I mean, I had been at Amherst College, and so where Eve was already a legendary figure, and I'd worked with Andy Parker, and Andy was like, you got to go study with Eve, and I met with Eve when I was here, but I was coming to the Lit program, and I mean, I feel like there's the cultures of Lit and English were kind of separate, and the group around Eve and Michael kind of bridged that divide in interesting ways. But I came to be in the Lit program. I work on like Russian literature, and I was anxious about, could I do Russian stuff here? So that was sort of what I was trying to sort out. But the reason I came, I mean, so I was coming from Amherst and you know, applying to graduate school, and most of my advisors were like, don't go to Duke. Because whatever, this is the Northeast, like elite, you know, academic situation. They were like, it's money. They're just like buying all these scholars. I mean, but their anxiety was that the people who are hired aren't really here.
Yeah.
Right, that they're just like getting paid all this money to just kind of show up briefly, and it's not really. And you know, the discourse of academic stars was sort of really rising at that moment. So I came down apprehensive about that, and was just wowed by the intellectual energy of the place. And it was the students who were already here. I mean, I remember meeting Katie. I remember talking to Katie for like an hour on East Campus somewhere, like, and
Coffee shop, the coffee place.
yeah, the coffee place or something. But it was at night. It was like, I don't know, there was some party or something. Anyway, people were just so excited to think together. There was a real energy around collective thinking that was immediately palpable. And I feel like the name for that at the time was theory. That was the sort of, that's what people were sort of committed to at the moment. So anyway, I mean, and I think, and so it was that energy already there among the students in Lit and English that sort of drew me, and then I got here, and then all the things that then happened, but we can, I'll state you know, how I came.
Okay, my name's Mandy. I was trying to think about this. So we were talking about this last night. All three of us went to little liberal arts colleges. I went to Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and which tells you everything you need to know about me. But no, I different than you guys. I feel like I kind of came out of left field because I took a year off after college. I managed a movie theater. I tried to figure out what I was doing. And in college, I had read Between Men. And I worked with someone in college named Barbara Getty, who had known Eve around Yale back in the day and was like, you got to read this book. You're going to love this. And I was like, okay. And I read it, and I thought it was amazing. And one of the things I thought was amazing about it, I wasn't really a theory head. I read Between Men and thought, this is brilliant. And I thought, this person is such an amazing reader of books. And, she was an English professor in a kind of, she had that. And I just thought, like, this is incredible. And so I really did apply to come here because Eve was here. And I was just like, I want to know what that is all about. And then I met you guys, and then that changed, everything changed. It was like a profound. So that's how I got here.
Thanks. So I'm interested to know what the collective looked like. How you actually shaped your thinking, your lives together. Today, so we're in a Humanities Institute. A lot of collective thinking goes on here, and it's in the form of 21st century collectives, one might say. We have humanities labs where faculty and graduate students come together to think through areas of research and teach students, undergraduates and graduate students. We have working groups. We have 12 graduate student working groups going on at the moment, and those are mostly organized around books, right? It's mostly reading groups, but some other things as well. And my sense is from my own days as a student, and also beginning a career. I mean, I moved to the US in 1991. Things are very different in terms of the environment that you work in collectively. Some things that today are broadly labeled very generally under the category of inappropriate seem totally normal in those days. I'm not necessarily asking you to reveal anything about yourselves here, but it's true. It was a very different kind of environment. There were more parties that went on after at the end of conferences. There were different ways of sharing space together, and work was done through that, right? Often with full acknowledgement of the complexities of transference, the problem of age, the difference in rank, and I'm just curious. You're all teachers now as well, at universities or colleges, and so I'm interested in hearing on how you reflect on that moment and those kinds of collectivities, and how you think about them in your own practices today as well.
Yeah, it was very social, and there's a lot of stories to tell, but I feel like a crucial thing, it was very social among the students, and we were talking last night about how Jose Munoz was really a kind of key force there. And the thing is like keeping a collective together takes work and sort of cajoling and maybe a little harassing and and Jose was like, you gotta come out to the film thing tomorrow. Otherwise, and he would be like angry if you didn't, he would,
it wasn't, yeah.
It wasn't optional, right?
So many lectures about you have a responsibility to leave your house, and I was like, no, I do not. Yes, you do. Okay.
But also, so Eve was living with Michael, which was already a kind of social situation, with Michael Moon, and, in the same house, and Hal was back and forth, and John Goldberg was there sometimes, and but she just had us out to her house all the time. Fred would have that big party at the beginning of the year out at his house where everyone came, and
the Duke basketball championships, watching them in his bedroom.
Yeah. It was very, there wasn't, there was not any sense of social distinction. And in fact, there was a sense that our presence socially was desired, valuable, and and Eve talks quite openly about that in Dialogue on Love, which I feel like is sort of the best memoir of that moment. This is where she talks about the promiscuous we, right? It was clear that she was seeking to create a rich space for thought and sociality and laughing, and and every time, and she would invite all the sort of key people doing queer work of that moment. I remember, talking to Judith Butler in her kitchen. I met Douglas Crimp at her house, who then became a really good friend. So it was just this sort of very rich social space that then also expanded outwards. And so, it's interesting to hear about, the sort of institutional, and we were sort of thinking about this too, the sort of institutional efforts to create like community or something. And there actually wasn't any of that at the moment, right? It was just like the sheer force of Eve's charisma combined with this particular group of students who are really committed to collectivity, with the backdrop of the AIDS crisis and the need for activism, that also definitely created an overall mood in which queer group formation it was just obvious. It was obvious that that was what had to happen.
And there were several like urgencies, like the AIDS pandemic and activism. We all knew, the world was ending in terms of, gay men in particular were dying, and we had friends who were sick and stuff like that. Eve's cancer diagnosis came the year I arrived, and that had a sense of kind of urgency to it, like, holy shit, what's happening with that? She was really open. She announced that in her class, and I remember she used to say, I used to be like, can I mention this to somebody? And she'd be like, I want everyone to talk about it because I don't want to have to talk about it. So she was just like, go tell everyone. And I was like, okay. And that was an urgency. We were in Durham in 1990.
Jesse Holmes.
Jesse Helms? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was crazy, that election and everything. And the institution, Duke, was, and I'm sure it's not anymore, racist, sexist, and homophobic, like out of control. And so it sounds like it was like a party, every single day. And one of the reasons we became so close, I think, is that we were just living in this hellstorm of like, where the hell are we? Why can't I eat anything except a biscuit? I love biscuits, but it was like, what? We had 9th Street. There was a block on 9th Street where you could go. Now, granted, people lived in Durham. I don't know where they've gone. I don't know where they've been pushed out to, but that's another thing to talk about. But like, so things were not good in 1990. And here we were, and we just had this space to breathe. And Eve, when I think of Duke, your time at Duke, I don't think of anything about the institution except Eve's house, which was open to all of us, and we didn't get invited over, we just went over. I mowed her lawn every week. Because she let me keep a lawnmower there, which made me happy. But we just, I don't think of the institution, I think of her house. And she really did that. We went to a party one time down at Hopkins, because Jonathan Goldberg, who was Michael Moon's partner, who recently died, had invited us or something. And we watched the faculty and the students in his apartment, and they were like, the faculty were over here and the students were over here, and it was very tense. And it just kind of, and I don't mean to sound like, they should be as cool as us. It just blew my mind. I was like, wow, they're not having a good time, and that was just not what it was like here. So,
And when we're talking about AIDS activism, a lot of us were in ACT UP Triangle together, and Eve was in it, and Michael, and community members. So Duke felt like a little island, as you were sort of alluding to, but that was one way that we actually met people outside of the academy and did organizing with them, and a lot of that happened at Eve's house. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So we were also sort of doing politics in certain ways, less than we might have, but at least through ACT UP. And Eve made this great T-shirt, which I just have to describe, which has Michelangelo's the David of the ass, right? And it says, "Know your assholes," and then it says, one is Jesse Helms, and the other one says, one is, an asshole, and it says, "This one deserves pleasure and respect." And that was Eve. And we would sell those, and that didn't necessarily go down so well in the region, but
But in MLA, people love them.
yeah. But so we were trying to live our activism, and I would also say though that one way that I feel we maybe educated Eve and Michael was through their own investments were in particular kinds of literature and particular traditions, and Eve made no bones about what she was passionate about, and that was usually the work of white gay men or white, what we would call queer men. And so there was a lot of conversation also about what was missing. And she and I edited several of her books. And so when we were working on tendencies, for instance, she has a chapter called How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay. But it was really about effeminate boys. And so I said, you need to put a subtitle on that, because that's what it's really about, and it's not about butch daughters. And so, we had that back and forth, and she was very open, and she wanted that from us. And when we did Gary in Your Pocket, which was a collection of journal entries and short fiction by Gary Fisher, who had been her student at Berkeley and died of AIDS very young, we talked about what the politics were of a white woman editing a book by a young gay black man, and the importance of having other voices introduce that text. And that was the kind, and you talked to her a lot about those kinds of things too, and you did too, and Jose certainly did. But there was a lot of back and forth, and certainly she gave me a lot of advice and helped me become the writer and scholar that I am, even though, she wasn't really interested in lesbians. Well, Willa Cather. But, but there was a sense of, again, this sort of openness and sometimes combativeness that we also had with one another, where we were confronting one another and
there was a lot of that.
Yeah, a lot of that. And sometimes there was competitiveness, and it was not completely rosy, but there was mainly generosity, I would say. And her generosity to me was extraordinary, and in both material and other kinds of ways. And my mother was possibly dying, and Eve said, "I'm buying your airplane ticket." So.
Oh, they fed us all the time.
Yeah, I was just gonna say generosity, but also like commitment to the group. I mean, I sort of feel like a lot of the fights, or like, and Mandy, you mentioned Jose being like, you have to come out. I feel like, among the students, or, competitiveness or whatever, was also just about this sense that everyone in the group was sort of, it's like, you were responsible for them. We were responsible for each other. So if someone else in the group was doing something you thought was like fucked up, you would be like, you can't do that.
Yeah, right.
And everyone thinks you shouldn't be doing that. And then you'd be like,
Lovely.
I didn't realize I was doing this thing that everyone's, But anyway, there was a lot of that. But I feel like that speaks to the sense that the group was primary, and the sense that if the group fell apart, we would all be like lost or whatever.
And that I think we were also at moments exclusionary.
We had
For sure.
We had a joke about who were the queer people and who were the vulgar gay people. Right? So it's just like, who's gay? And then, and so Jose used to call me and him the vulgar gays. Yeah, it was. I mean, I watched the video of Stanley and Jane talking last week because I kind of wanted to know what this was like, and I hadn't seen Stanley in a long time, and I love his story of just he said, and he always says this. He's always said this. I didn't have an ideology. I was just trying to get all these good people and build this apartment and stuff, and it's really true that we just carved the space out from, a lot of it was what wasn't in Durham, what we feel like we didn't have, and we just like made with each other. I mean, there weren't places to hang out. We didn't have a bar. We had people's houses and stuff like that. So like, there are these, part of it was like deprivation, people were sick, people were dying. I mean, the racism that people like Jose encountered here, just all these things in particular, brought us together, as happens, I think. I think if, anybody had been like, come on in and make a crazy collective, it would have been like, it's not gonna work,
So thinking from your positions today, how is the collective something that you think of in relation to queer theory? Like when you teach it or when you expand its boundaries, use it. I don't know exactly how to say these things, but what's shifted? And do you, when you teach queer theory, do you try to evoke something of its site of your origin and its origin at Duke? Do you think of it in a different way? I'm curious about the now and then.
So is it like a question about like how does that kind of collectivity like survive institutions and stuff like that?
Yes, and also what happens to queer theory when it's not that?
Yeah, I mean, queer theory now feels like historical or something, right? I mean, there's some sort of transition from when it felt like active and insurgent, and then there was a middle period, but now it's like we're looking back at this previous moment. And I mean, I was really affected by that Sarah Schulman book that came out a couple years ago about the history of ACT UP New York, the sort of oral, that she put together from her, she interviewed everyone who was still alive from ACT UP New York, and then sort of compiled this book from that, which reads kind of like a, a realist novel or something. But reading that really made me think that, okay, queer theory would have been impossible without ACT UP and the sort of activist context, or that was very much, there was a real back and forth between those two things. So lately I've been teaching queer theory in relation to ACT UP, those essays by Douglas Crimp, How to Have Promiscuity in an Epidemic and Mourning and Militancy, I think were really important to a lot of us then, and are still, I think, really affect people students, undergraduates, when they read those texts now. So anyway, so we just say the collectivity and the kind of and Katie was talking about this earlier, the need for ACT UP to be a non-identitarian space and to be a space not oriented around identities but around practices. But also one where gay men and lesbians were in it together in a way that sort of hadn't quite happened previous to that moment. And Sarah Schulman really emphasizes how important the feminist activists who had been around in the early 70s and been part of activism, radical feminism in the 70s, basically taught all the gay men in New York ACT UP like what civil disobedience was, how to have a meeting, how to plan an action, because they didn't have that political experience. So anyway, I feel like a lot of that kind of fed into the kinds of conversations and ways that we were thinking.
Do you remember when Eve hired that person to come to her house and teach us all civil disobedience? Do you remember that?
I do. Yeah,
We
yeah.
were all at her
yeah.
house, and she had somebody come and tell, here's how you get arrested. Here's what you do this. Here's what you do that. And remember that? That was crazy. I'd forgotten that until now.
I mean, it feels sometimes strange to teach epistemology, as you say, but I actually think that a lot of my students are in a very taxonomic moment of identity, and so there's a plurality of possibilities, and so to teach that intro is often still very challenging to them, and sort of saying to them, how do we make community is still relevant. I think but it does also, they're kind of like, it's of a very different moment for them, at least when we go into it. I think also of Jose's Cruising Utopia and the need for utopian thinking. And we're making it sound as if it were a utopia. It was and it wasn't. And Jose's version is something else. But that desperate need to think about futurity at this moment is very relevant to my students.
I taught last year or last semester, I can't remember when, a trans literature class. And that was a really interesting, it was the first time I had done it, and it gathered people in a way that was really interesting, right? And we kind of, we were working through what's all the language for all these things, and it had a really interesting kind of vibe to it of like, we're doing something that at least we all hadn't done before, and certainly lots to read and talk about and stuff, but that was cool. And it had that kind of sense of people, are you in that class? Yeah, I'm in that class, wink, wink, that was kind of cool. But, institutions don't care about collectivity, I think. And, institutions care about institutions. And, a lot of the kind of stuff that we, had we gone out and been like, we will emulate Eve's teaching, would have been fired like immediately, because you're gonna have all your students over your house all the time mowing your lawn? I don't think so, and so it became, so that was tricky. That was a tricky thing to do. You couldn't go out and be Eve, but Jose did a great job. Jose he was at NYU, and he just emulated Eve's teaching so much and had people to his house and had really great relationships with his students who I now know and I'm friends with, because that's how kind of expansive that was. And he was like super committed to that, and he was doing it in an amazing way. And he had the kind of position and the resources to do that after he got tenure.
Well, there's a way in which, what you're saying is that institutions do care about collectivities. They're terrified of them, right? So even though, you think the classroom should be a collectivity of some sort, that, these projects of learning together should be about a kind of, sense of a project that you're all invested in and arguing about and shaping and all that sort of thing. Actually, the push to professionalism is all about denying collectivity, right? Yeah. Were you going to say something, Katie? Is it?
You know, you're talking about class. I mean, anyway, I was just sort of trying to think a little bit about classes with Eve. I mean, the funny thing about Eve, you know, we're talking about sort of, she gathered this collective around her, and this, I mean, she was so shy, and she had this little voice that Mandy does well, and
You're going to have to at some point.
I mean, it's just quite surprising that you meet Eve for the first time and you're like, you know, it's sort of surprising that this group, I mean, you sort of, whatever, you think of, okay, what enables groups to happen? And you think of a charismatic personality who's able to get up in front of people and talk and sort of cajole people and get, you know, and Eve just had this tiny little voice and she was really quiet. But I think a lot, but I think two things. I mean, one, I mean, I think this goes to her as a teacher, the power of her attention was extraordinary. To have the sense that she was paying attention to what you wrote or what you were saying was just like electrifying, and just you could sort of feel yourself like getting smarter by every 30 seconds simply by virtue of her, you being like, yeah, that's great, you know. So I feel like so I think Eve just did a tremendous amount of pedagogical work and mentoring work and sort of one-on-one work with, I mean, my most transformative moments with Eve were definitely moments when it was just the two of us, like sitting on her couch or whatever, rather than in the classroom or something like that. But the other thing I think is that we were all, as we were taking classes with her and around, were reading her work extremely carefully and attentively, right? So I feel like her writing, which she was producing while we were there, and she would often circulate drafts to all of us just in photocopies from the dot matrix printer or whatever. But I remember reading Queer and Now in draft, White Glasses, the essay they wrote for her friend Michael Lynch, who was dying, in draft. And all of us students, I feel like, would read and then also talk with each other about, oh, could you believe that line or that thing that she said? And so that intensive practice of reading and sort of one-on-one mentorship, I mean, in terms of like how institutions or how teachers sort of manage to sort of produce this kind of environment, I think of that as part of what created it.
I mean, it was a moment, but it kind of doesn't feel attached to this place. And I don't know this place anymore. But I didn't really know it that well then either. You know, because, so not in a bad way. It was like the institution was trying to make this not happen. But even when we went to classes and stuff, people kind of thought we were weird. You know, those Eve people, or I don't know. It was just a funny thing. So it was kind of extra institutional, even though it was, and I guess that's when you were trying to think institutionally, like, so Stanley had all this money and he did this stuff, and Fred, and then just shit happened that I think they couldn't have anticipated. Not that they didn't want it to happen, but they couldn't have anticipated it, and there we were. And we didn't know what was happening. You know, we were just
I think we were all super annoying in seminars, actually.
Oh, I think
I'm
we were.
sure that because because there was a sense that we're this sort of insurgent people doing queer theory. I remember having a long argument with Naomi Shore
Oh God, Toro
about
and I got into it.
you know, about how Freud's narcissism essay was really homophobic or whatever. You know, anyway, but I feel like we sort of, and there was definitely a tension between the people around Fred and that sort of Marxist theory group and
Yeah, the
people
Marxists
around.
and the queer theorists were fighting.
But I was somehow I was sort of in both. I mean, Fred was my director and I was in Lit. Anyway, I was sort of back and forth between them. But that was, but I feel like that was also constitutive of the collectivity of the, or whatever, the sort of group feeling of the moment was also, we were embattled, right? We were and insurgent. And then, and to have another group that you could be arguing with was actually, even though we were like, those fucking guys, I can't believe it, was also energizing in a way, right?
So say more about the battle between the queer theorists and the Marxists.
So when I was 22, I would have said something like, the Marxists just can't theorize pleasure. They just don't understand it, you know? They just don't get it. It's not important to them. And then they were like, all these people want to talk about is fun and sex, and they don't understand, you know, capital.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think among some students, I mean, there were more sophisticated and more vulgar versions of this, but one vulgar version was just like the queer theorists are not, they're not thinking about class. It's all about class, and anything else is superficial and needs to ultimately be.
I will say the Marxists turned out to be right.
But there was also, I mean, we organized this conference on Andy Warhol, a sort of queer Warhol conference. I guess that was 92 or 93. And that was a site of real conflict between those two visions, because Fred gave a talk. I mean, in retrospect, I feel a little bit bad about how sort of, I feel like we were kind of mean to Fred or something. Fred. So we organized this conference. It was mainly like a queer Warhol conference, but Fred gave a talk on Warhol.
And getting him to give the talk was
and it called and he I think he called Saint Andy. And I tried to get him to sort of find it. I mean, I'm curious to read it, because I remember thinking at the time, oh, this is actually like pretty interesting. It was based on like Sartre's thing on Genet, and so. But then Mandy Merck gave this paper which absolutely skewered Fred's reading of Van Gogh and Warhol in the postmodernism book. And she basically said, okay, so Fred says in that book that, the Van Gogh shoes, you can see how they're attached to a historical context. They have dirt on them. They're clearly like, peasants. But he's like, the Warhol shoes are like, it's the diamond dust and it's all surface and it's separated from everything. And Mandy Merck was like, well, actually, if you read this biography of Warhol, you realize that those shoes are drag queen shoes. And so there is a very specific social context for that. And so she kind of, and she also delivered it with great verve and humor, and like the whole audience was laughing with her.
He was sort of pissed,
and Fred was.
He was so.
Fred was not happy about that afterwards. So that was a moment when that conflict kind of came to a head. I mean, of course, there's a way in which. That moment of conflict didn't necessarily feel political, actually. It was more, whatever, we're all academics and we all want to seem smarter than everybody. It was also just like competitive or something, right? There was a sort of outdoing one another element of that too. And I think that was true also among the graduate students. Certainly, we're all very anxious to show here we were smarter than everybody else, or smart enough to be in the conversation or whatever, and that produces a kind of agonistic competitiveness that I think was overlaid on these sort of theoretical, disagreements.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question and then ask for some questions from our audience here. And that is, we've talked about the context a lot, but I want to hear a little bit more on what it meant for your work at the time. Like on the dissertations, on the papers you wrote for classes. I imagine that being shaped in a certain way through this experience of the collectivity, probably got you into trouble with some of your professors as well, and how you navigated that, how you navigated trying to think through something different and new when you had a committee, for example. How do you negotiate that? Or how did you negotiate that? And what do you feel opened up in your own projects by being allowed to and sometimes not allowed to do the things that you did?
I remember in class having disagreements with the professor in a way that I don't know that I've ever seen. And I'd have to sort of stand up for my disagreement with their, and it happened with Fred in class, and it happened with some other folks
Happened
too.
with Fred, happened with Toral,
Yeah.
happened with Jen Radway, happened with everybody. We were in those classes. Excuse me, you're not accounting for the mama, you know. Sometimes it was good. Sometimes it really didn't go over well.
But, you know, I wrote something for Fred that became the basis of a chapter of my dissertation. So it was useful. I think that I was lucky in that my committee, and Tom is one of my committee members, I managed to find sympathetic people. And it was more when I went on the job market that I had the serious issues where I would be interviewed at the MLA, and at the end of the interview, the people would say, well, that was fascinating. We really wanted to learn about queer theory, but we could never hire you. And my first tenure track job was in Arizona, and I was not allowed to talk about sexuality in the public school because it was against the law. And so I was there as the theorist. And, you know, that's coming again.
Yeah, I know. Well, remember how courses that we were teaching when we first were on teaching had to be courses that were titled in such a way that it didn't say anything gay, lesbian, or queer on people's transcripts. So it was always like, you know, the introduction to the philosophy of the blah, da, 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 and then it was like the introduction, you know, on your transcript.
Yeah.
And that, you know, I was like, okay. But yeah, it's interesting to think about. I thought of something. Going on the job market was like what you're talking about. Oh my God, just getting harassed. Like I had people in the job market say things to me like, damn, Eve Sedgwick wrote this letter for you. And it's amazing. And we just had to meet the person that went with this letter. You know, and I was like, are you fucking kidding me? You know, I was like, yeah. And they were like, you know, they're kind of looking at me, are you that great? And then, you know, I'd be like, okay, well, we'll see you. People did not like her, and they did not like us. And I had, my favorite story I want to tell is it's really a John story that we've kind of pumped up into a myth. But Harvard was trying to hire Eve, and she wasn't interested. And John went on the market and got an interview at Harvard. And somebody at Harvard asked him, well, how are you different than Eve Sedgwick? And what Eve said he should have said was, if you offered me a job, I'd take it.
No. Unlike Eve Sedgwick, I would take a job at Harvard.
Yeah. But he didn't say that, but I've imagined that.
I was wearing her, I had borrowed her tie. So I was like, I guess this isn't the moment to say that I'm actually wearing her clothes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, I mean, that's the thing is we sort of, you know, so we're in this bubble here, and then you go out into the world and you realize actually people like hate queer theory or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, you know, one has to be defensive or whatever. But I wanted to say just about the sort of Marxism queer sort of conflict or whatever. Eve and Fred, on the other hand, I feel like always got along with each other quite well. And they were both they were on tons of committees together. They were both very generous with each other. And so, you know, it was more among the competitiveness among the grad students, I think, where that kind of tension flourished.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about, and I don't know if this has changed, but when people came to do talks at Duke when we were grad students, job talks are just talks. Academic talks here were a blood sport. Do you remember that, Tom? And it was scary. And, you know, I mean, it was really just like, okay, who's going to take them down now? And it was not, and I remember going out to do like my first, I think I went to University of Arizona to give a paper or something. And I was ready to shoot bears. You know, I was just like, okay, come on, bring it, you know. And people were like, hey, you know, this part of your paper, maybe you could think about this because that might be really helpful for you. You know, and I was like, what? I was like, come on, are you tricking me? You know. But it was not fun, and it was terrifying to watch our and I don't mean even Michael, I mean other people just take people down, and that took a lot of time to shake that off. Just to say that was.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, but to try to return to your question about how this earlier moment like shaped our work or whatever. I mean, I think it's definitely true. I mean, maybe, you know, for me, definitely the sense, Eve's interest in depression, and my own like sense of being as a depressed graduate student, being depressed with Eve. I mean, that's kind of what my first book is about, what it means to be depressed with other people, or how that can, you know, or how, you know, how that can transform into something antidepressive. So I think that emphasis on collectivity, you know, really shaped my thinking, but also Eve's emphasis on Eve's, you know, emphasis as a thinker, but also the emphasis of the space on the, just on the primacy of the we. The primacy of the, I mean, that's actually sort of all I really think about is like, so, and like what it takes to constitute a collective. How is it that collectives come into being when they do come into being? Because sometimes they do, and like, what is it that makes it happen? And it's interesting. I mean, it's, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think about how that happened at Duke at this particular moment.
I don't know. I feel like we should end on that, but I haven't mentioned her experimental critical writing class. And that was also a very, for the time, very unusual, where she let us just experiment with writing different kinds of things than just what at the time was sort of standard academic analysis. And I was writing about the Girl Scouts and my experience in the Girl Scouts, and sort of my attachment to sappy camp songs that were really love songs to other women, and weaving in different voices in the work that I did in that. And it was I wrote a very long paper, and that became the basis of my first book, because part of it was recognizing where my attachments were, where they were coming from in terms of my own life, and certainly feminist analysis had done that, but this was something different in writing that out. And my first book is about sort of the emergence of lesbian identity in the US, and these spaces of intense disciplinarity that also produce other kinds of erotics. So the Girl Scouts being, you know, this sort of nationalist organization, very different now than it was at the time. But the ways in which she encouraged us also to, and again, to think, and I think this was from her feminism, actually, to think about where in your own life, and you're talking about depression, right? Where does that, how can you make that part of your academic work? And that seems kind of silly now almost, because it's become so much more widespread. But in 1989 or 90, it was revolutionary, and that sense of, she says, oh, I want a life where work and love are indistinguishable. And I think about, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that was what she was teaching us at its best.
Thank you. Let's go to the audience and see if there are questions.
And we have a
Yes,
microphone for
Katya.
everyone, just to have it on
Katya
record.
has a... I have a big voice. I don't need it. No, you do for the recording. Sorry.
Thanks for organizing this conversation. It must be really fun for you all. I'm Katya Wazalowski. I teach in cultural anthropology and dance, and I went to Reed with Mandy. I was traumatized by her first girlfriend. Her girlfriend. Anyway, that's another story. But when I first got to Duke, I was I was in culture shock from Reed, right? That the kind of pre-professional, and for the undergraduate population, sort of anti-intellectualism, which even though I saw it in the graduate program, and I taught mainly freshmen, and I would tell them that I chose Reed for 3 reasons: no grades, no football team, and no Greek system. And they would look at me and say, that's not university, you know. So, but what I was hearing you say about the collective, that it really came out of a particular mentor, intellectual mentor, who was both an intellectual academic, but the love and work, right, that did something else. And also having an embodied practice of the activism, right? So you were having these intense conversations, having this intense relationship with a mentor, but also out in the world doing kind of embodied things, right? Practical theory, bringing your theory and praxis together. And that's something, you know, I very much try to create in my classes, partly because I'm a dancer also, so there's a seminar studio overlap, and I think we're in this moment, and ungrading now after many years, I'm able to do a form of what we did at Reed or what was at Reed with ungrading, and trying to create an atmosphere where something happens. And I had a student write that on an evaluation. She enjoyed coming to class because it felt like something was happening together in class. But at the same time, I'm struggling because and I know a lot of professors here are trying to do this at the undergraduate level, especially more kind of experiential learning. But what I feel is dropping out is what I hear all your experience also was slowness, the slow experience. I feel like our undergraduates are so into collecting, experiences and then moving on immediately without doing the self-reflection, So I'm trying to, how do you balance, I'm asking, my question is what strategies, and I feel myself, I assign fewer and fewer entire books in my classes. Even though I resist, and I think that was what we did at Reed, read entire books in a week, because I feel the students, I can't get them to slow down and read deeply and reflect. And so I'm wondering, if you all have any strategies for creating this slow education, slow scholarship, slow reading in this moment where I feel the pressure also to create these experiences for them. So that's my question.
I don't know. I mean, I was just thinking when John was talking about something, how, like, when we were grad students, we spent all this time together, but we didn't have cell phones. I mean, I drove around. Oh, let's see his house? No, let's drive over to the other person's house or whatever. And, not to, like, blame social media, but just to say I don't know the answer to this. Like, it's really tricky. I had a great experience teaching that Kaji Aman article about trans stuff in my translit class, and because all the students, I mean, he basically makes this argument that, like, everybody identifies now as non-binary, and he's real grumpy about it. And the students, and so it was really in the face of the students who all identify as whatever. And my God, we had a great conversation, but it had been a long time since I'd had a conversation like that. And so kind of chasing the pulse of how to make something happen. I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
It's a struggle for me too. And it's partly, I mean, I teach at a small liberal arts college that has its own reputation as being very, very challenging, and the students perform busyness all the time. And it's all about work, and we have a recent graduate in the audience. And they seem to need to have something to do all the time. And that also is the pressure that they're going out into the world to to deal with, and you know, the precarity that we're in. And so I don't want to fault them for that. But, you know, I do have to say things like you actually have to buy the books and bring them to class. And I hadn't ever had to do that until this fall, and that was a real shock. And it was first year, so they're new to college, and they also are the pandemic. The pandemic, we can't underestimate what the pandemic has done. And my partner's a high school teacher and would tell you that that is something that, and this, you know, this group especially, but trying to slow down our reading in the classroom, and that I actually go back to Eve for sure. Let's look, and this is just old-fashioned close reading, but let's look at this passage, and sometimes that works, and sometimes, and then there is also teaching very material that feels very, very, like Kaji's work, significant, but you can't always do that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's my answer.
I was talking to a student about I love performing busyness. Like at our school, every student has like an internship. It's in Washington D.C., right? So it's like an internship, and is it a good one? And is it blah, blah, blah. And they're busier than I've ever been in my life, just in terms of how their time is structured. Plus they work because college is criminally expensive and all this stuff, right? So it's just like crazy. And I remember saying to the student one time, I was like, dude, like you're gonna burn out by the time you're 30. And the student said to me, look at the world, am I gonna live to 30? And I was like, okay. You know, it was kind of this, yeah, this feeling of the impending apocalypse of if it's the climate or whatever it is. And, you know, it was like, I don't have as long as you had, so I'm just crushing everything in. And I was like, holy shit, you know, that's profound.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the question about teaching is it's a big question. I mean, I feel like but it makes me just think about how the social function of the university has shifted so dramatically from the 90s to now, and what it is that students are trying to get out of a university education. I mean, of course, the collapse of the job market for PhD students is sort of constitutive of the whole group mood in a way that, I mean, not that we felt like there were tons of jobs in the 90s, but people got jobs. So that was different. I mean, but I feel like it really matters what kind of an institution you're talking about too. I mean, so I'm in the middle of a transition from Wayne State University in Detroit. It's working class students commuting. Almost all of them are working. Many of them are working full time. They're just trying to get through and hopefully like have a job. And their education is just playing a role in that process. So it took me a while to adjust to this, but it was just like, okay, look, I'm just here to help them get through. I don't want to make any barriers. I want to make it as easy for them to get through as possible. And if they can like get interested in something while that's happening, then, you know, great. So I mean, now I'm at the University of Chicago, which is like a whole different situation. But I feel like the level of anxiety for young people now is much higher than it was in general at the earlier moment. And that both increases the importance of slowing down, but it also makes it really hard to slow down. And in terms of embodied, you know, whatever, Free Palestine, in terms of embodied experiences, I mean, my own experience, I mean, so, you know, experiences in ACT UP in the 90s have definitely shaped my, you know, and also with divestment. You know, I was in college when we were encouraging the universities to divest from South Africa. And in my first weekend of college, I was like at a protest, protesting the trustees to like divest from South Africa, which incidentally worked. And they did divest, and there was no longer apartheid in South Africa, I would like to point out, as we all know. But which is to say, my relation to the university now is also totally shaped by the brutally repressive police response to students protesting to end the genocidal war in Palestine. And that is as true at Wayne State as it is at the University of Chicago. And a lot of my students, Wayne, there's a huge Palestinian and Lebanese American population with family members who are being killed with like their own like tax dollars or whatever. So that was a student population that was deeply invested in that, in those acts of protesting, and I felt very. I felt an ethical responsibility to support those students in that, and I think that definitely goes back to my experience here in the 90s and the permission given to us by our teachers to be activists in ways that were disruptive, unlawful, and it might lead to our arrest. And so I feel like that's important also for us as faculty members to model at moments like this.
I had a funny moment recently of our group for Palestine on our campus got their protest shut down, as they always do. But this time it was for amplification of sound. And I had this great moment where it's like, oh my God, I have something to help them with. Like, and I just came in and was like, no, you don't use the microphone. You just yell it. Everybody yells it, and like we did. And they were like, that's such a good idea. And I was like, I know, but it was like, that was so cool, it's what's happening on college campuses right now around Palestine is disgusting, sickening, and makes me want to run away from the academy.
I mean, thanks for that. I mean, in many ways, sort of thinking about the 90s as a moment of pandemic and one that we've just been through, does allow for a kind of thinking around scale, right? The threat of loss in a different. Someone was saying to me yesterday. A student was saying to me that that was pointing out the peculiarity of the way in which so much of the discourse around the pandemic went back 100 years to the Spanish flu, and just left out HIV/AIDS, and it's a very different kind of discourse, and it was embedded in that other moment of anti-apartheid activism for all of us who went through college in the 80s and early 90s. It was, we used to talk about ourselves as the generation that was being killed because of no pleasure was possible. All the moralistic discourse, all the kind of, oh my God, at school even, like the bananas and the condoms and everything. It's like enough to put anyone off sex for life, right? I mean, really, this is how you will live your lives, and where some kind of idea of both local and international activism was brought into play, didn't seem to have the same kind of debilitating sense of scale. We somehow navigated the scale. And I think that that's something that maybe we need to work on collectively today. We sort of think about the scales of the planetary crisis, and anxiety only increases. But at another moment, which was also planetary, and also, looking at different kinds of localities and huge major problems that were affecting everyone. We seem to find a way to do the activism, and of course that has something to do also with institutions. How you think about pushing against, and what histories you came in with about pushing against the institutions that were stopping protests. So, other questions from the audience before we close up? Barbara.
Hi. Good morning. Thank you all so much for this incredible conversation. I really appreciate it, and I've learned so much. I have a question actually about institutions and our commitments to them, given kind of the conversations y'all have been having about the ways in which, in a lot of ways, the institution is the its entire sort of like objective is to contain and oppress and push against sort of these theorizations that you're doing and the work that you're doing, and yet all three of you have chosen to engage in the and as a grad student, right, who sort of like is sitting in that space of activism, scholarship, and recognizing that both kind of have to exist together, but sometimes what's happening out in the world gets lost in this space, even as we're thinking and theorizing about it. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about just the choices that you have sort of have found yourself making as you've sort of continued to remain in these institutions, and how sort of perhaps thinking a little bit within undercommons too. I've really appreciated sort of the conversation we've talked about with Eve, sort of really creating spaces for you to be in and out at the same time. Can you just talk a little bit about the choices you've made as you've continued to stay in the institutions?
So it's like, how can you work at institutions when you know how horrible they are?
Yeah. Thank you. I was
I
got caught up in my own question a little bit.
I don't know. That's like the adult life thing. I mean, I bought a house like 5 years ago. I own property now, and it makes me sick. I love my house, and I have 2 kids now. Like, I'm a fucking homonormative that lives in the suburbs of Maryland. You know what I mean? Like, and you do what you can, and then you drive your car. I don't know. Like, no, it's bullshit, though. It's bullshit. And I think about it all the time. And I try to convince myself that thinking about it is at least better than not thinking about it. But, I needed a job. You're going to need a job. We all need jobs. And I think of institutions as, one of the things I love about Stanley's kind of like, I just hired a bunch of people and I didn't care what they did and all the stuff, is that like institutions, all I think about the academy is that it's a shitload of resources that people are using really badly. And so when somebody uses it well, I'm like, yay, and you just try to think about like, where can the academy like put those resources, and can you get into a place in the academy where you're able to help facilitate that, But it doesn't make you like a good person.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Eve just had a lot of freedom, actually. I mean, I feel like that was sort of part of what happened at that moment is, so the university just sort of stayed out of her way, and just, kind of let it happen. But I feel like there is, I feel like there's still quite a bit of autonomy and freedom within the academy, to create collectives in the classroom, but also activist collectives. So, whatever, the undercommons. I mean, it's there. It's always there, right? And although I feel like the effort of the university at this moment is, over the last 20 years, has been constantly to increase its capacity to monitor and control, and we're constantly being evaluated or producing evaluations and numbers in order to justify our existence and all those things. So all of that I feel like is a problem and decreases freedom. But I think spaces of autonomy still exist and occasionally really flower up to produce sort of different and exciting things. So I think things are still possible within the university as an institution, as things are still possible in lots of institutions, though the university, I feel like still, which is why, what's his name, Vance is like, the professors are the enemy or whatever, right? I mean, I think it's still perceived to be a space of critique, resistance, and where groups capable of actually consequential political action can still be formed. I think the powers are still there. I mean, this is why the repression is so strong. They're afraid of the student protests. They're really afraid.
I think I mean, it's a question I struggle with every day. And, you know, my own story of coming through institutions is complicated and, you know, but I felt I had nowhere else to go a lot of the time. So starting with undergrad. So, and so I try to think about my students in that regard. And I think try to be a mentor for them. And that sounds really sappy. And to try to make institutional change sometimes with catastrophic results, and try to maximize what I can get from the resources that I have for what I hope is a good. But I'm at an extraordinarily resourced undergraduate only institution there's a few graduate programs, and I think that's slightly different than being at a place with graduate students. And so I haven't had to have some of those difficult dilemmas in that regard. But telling someone to go to graduate school is something I say only if it's the only thing you could possibly imagine doing, and I hate to have to do that. But as I would just say to John's point too, again, we are considered the ones who've destroyed America. You know, that's what. But that, you know, right now we are the wedge. We are one of the big wedge issues in faculty, but also queer, trans. You know, we're out for your children. The whole recruitment, everything is right there.
And it's all the same.
And it's the same, here it is again. And that's not the only thing, right? Certainly we want to remember critical race theory. We want to remember those Marxists. And but that doesn't mean that we aren't, the hypocrisy of our situation isn't absolutely present at all times, which is that, you know, my institution is being funded by its investments in all kinds of horrific things. And so it's something I think about.
Yeah, the thing that gets me through is, and that I say to people sometimes, I don't know if it's just a formulation that helped me, it's like, you do not have to identify with the place that you work. And you do not have to identify with any of the shit they make you do to keep your job, right? You have to do it to keep your job, but you do not have to identify it with it and love it, you know? And I just think about that a lot. And that's kind of the cool thing about academia, I guess, right? Is that I was in a group one time with some people in D.C. And they were lawyers and stuff. And I remember saying, they were like, how's your job or something? And I said something like, you know, I really like my work, but I don't like my job. And this guy looked at me like he was like, what are you saying? You know, you know what I mean? And I was like, oh. And we had this really interesting conversation where I was like, well, don't you have work product that like you did really well on a case and then someone might hire you because of that? And you know, he just didn't have that sense of separation. And that's a really important space, right? Of like, I work for this place, but then I also have like my work that's kind of separate. And I'm not suggesting it isn't fraught with, you know, what helped you make that work and who's going to publish it and all that, but just don't identify with this stuff. You don't have to.
The only other very brief thing I would add to that is the institution I was at previously, Wayne State, was a unionized campus. And so if and when you can belong to a union of workers, that really changes the calculus, because then sort of constitutively you don't identify with the institution, and it sets up a very clear, it makes explicit the opposition of interests between workers and management that is otherwise, especially at very wealthy institutions, it pretended as if that doesn't exist. That tension. So it was nice to be at a place where that was openly, was a site of collective formation.
And those things, labor unions and universities are starting again to try to come together. I mean, if those spaces were 10 years ago, people were talking about, the last bastions of the left, unions and universities, and they were both crumbling. And there's a lot, like at my institution, unionization is a big thing that, is happening again. And that is really good. And I don't know if Duke is still like the biggest union buster on earth. They are, yeah. We tried to organize as grad students here, and it was
Now organized.
good.
Yes.
When we tried it, we just got ran over. More power to you.
Yes. Yeah. Just we are out of time, but go ahead. One more. Yeah. So.
I want to guard against this idea that that there's moral purity, and I think it's a fantasy to think that we can be living outside of institutions. We're always embedded in all kinds of institutions, and so this idea that you go and you have a job, but you don't have to identify. I think we stand in a lot of different complicated relations to all over the world. We're part of nation states and various kinds of groups and class stuff and all kinds of things. And recognizing that there is no moral purity is a very important thing.
One of my favorite things that Eve used to say was her opposition to high moral groundism. She was always opposed to moralizing, even though she was a very sharp critic and could be outraged. But I think, but she was against the sort of that sort of moralizing. So I think that's correct. But I don't think I don't see those things as contradictory. You can you don't have to believe in moral purity to protest apartheid, right?
Well, this idea that we can live a life outside of
Right. Yeah.
That we're always complicit
It's
in
impossible.
some way.
It's impossible.
We're always
That's
complicit,
what I meant by
and then we do our little thing, and we try to do more.
Right. Yeah. The complicities that we live with, in other words. No, sure. The impossibility of moral purity. But, what you sketched out here, someone was saying last week about Fred's house. You've said something about Eve's house, and, they're adjacent to the institutions that we work in. It does seem as if this sort of, a kind of, well, to use Jose Munoz term, this disidentification is something that many of us live with all the time, right? And yet there are some things like the embrace of the long form in the context of technology and short sound bites, the sense of staying with work, slowing it all down, in order to give people a sense of how people have made sense of the world before, as I keep saying, is one of the main functions of what we do in the humanities, right? Those are available in some spaces, right? You just have to make those spaces, and relative autonomy in the classroom. My first job was at the University of Utah, and I was teaching in women's studies. And one of the things that was very striking to me is that undergraduate students at the age of 18, 19, 20, they'd actually lived ever such a lot. I had all sorts of ideas of what it meant to be teaching feminist and a developing new queer theory at that time. But, there were also, I remember Henry Abelov was there, for a year. Catherine Stockton was beginning to do all her stuff in queer theory. You know, there were spaces that were part of, but adjacent to the institution, where it was just possible to do all sorts of things that I wouldn't necessarily have expected to be able to do. So, you know, I do think that there's something to be said about claiming a space in the university, and which is also about claiming the humanities, I think, in the university. I'm not saying that good work doesn't go on elsewhere, but it definitely goes on in the humanities when we open ourselves to these questions of complicity, protest, what is new, what is not new, what's possible and what's an impossibility. So with that, I think we should probably close off this more formal part. Feel free to pick up more food, chat informally, and I just want to say a big thank you to the three of you. It's been a real pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much.